Hello everyone, this is Stephen Scott, and I'm going to talk about my study digitally, in which I titled, How Do 8th Graders Engage in Writing Groups? So I really wanted to find out what my 8th graders were talking about in writing groups to enhance their writing. I was looking at verbal and written strategies, the roles they took on, and the specificity with which they used to speak. Examining these will tell me which of them I need to spend more time on with my students and which ones they already know and have mastered. And so, as a result, I really want my students to feel empowered in collaborative discussions. So, as introductory information will yield, I'm asking, how often do students consciously engage in specialized talk? Well, frequently, but I wanted to bring these conversations to a conscious level. So to start to frame my study, we were writing magazine articles or informational writing, and I didn't have a set page length or anything, but because of that, I let my students choose their topics, hopefully with which they have experience. And wow, was I amazed about how much they knew. They were experts, they really were. So, to prepare, we had many lessons on writing traits such as word choice, organization, effective leads and conclusions, and the like. We practiced using these in our writing a little bit, and we got feedback, and then we started to talk about group norms, and then we really focused on what needs to happen in terms of writing in our groups. So the literature I read came from Communication to Curriculum by Douglas Barnes, examining the exploratory and presentational features of talk, Carol Dweck's mindset, and that really opened my eyes in terms of how I view my students' view on intelligence. Moving on to Hayakawa's abstraction ladder from Language and Thought in Action, I really cannot turn this switch off in terms of how specific in general people are talking and writing. And Peter Johnson's Opening Minds really helped me again listen to how I use talk with and for my students, because that affects their role in the classroom and mine too. And finally, Neil Mercer and Hodgkinson's Exploring Talk in School reminded me that basically my talk needs to be productive, my students' talk needs to be productive more importantly, and in order for that to happen, it needs to be reflected on and practiced frequently. So moving on to the methodology, I chose my groups randomly. So the first 5 names I drew out of a cup was a group, and then after my groups were formed, I made group sticks, and then I drew those out of a cup. And I think I chose the third one out of one class, which I also chose randomly, making class sticks, if you will, to randomize which class I was going to choose. And then my data comes from the writing group discussions, the interviews, and in the future, writing samples. But for this presentation, just the group discussions and interviews. So my writing group, and I'm calling it mine because I followed them, of course, but my writing group met 5 times from as little as 10 minutes to up to about 20 minutes in duration. Now, I know we are going for 6 meetings to reach saturation. However, I had lots of data to code and a lot of data with which to work. The interviews that I conducted helped me understand how my students viewed the writing group experiences. And then the 2 lenses that I used to code my data were group roles by Alan Howe and, like I said earlier, Hayakawa's abstraction ladder. On to some findings. And here we are with some findings. So what I found was students often took on the roles of contributor or clarifier. They were asking each other to restate their ideas and ask for additional information, like, what do you mean by that? Or, I don't get that. Can you explain it to me again or in a different way? When they were contributing, they were making suggestions, expressing opinions, and just sharing ideas like, oh, I think that sounds great, or I think that sentence should go here for a great topic sentence. The other roles included were, as you can see, initiating, moving the discussion on, summarizing, monitoring group progress, and supporting and encouraging others. Now, real quick, the last two down there, supporting and encouraging others and tracking the progress of the group, fall under the category of roles that bring the group together. And those two roles were very infrequently taken on. And I found that to be troublesome for the group sometimes when they perhaps didn't know what they needed to be focusing on, like word choice or transitions. And sometimes they just didn't know what they needed to be doing. And so when I pull my other data, you'll see that Heather was often the one to clarify and move the discussion on. All right, now it's your turn. I'm going to give you a discussion between Trey and Daniel, and I want to see if you can find out what's happening. What roles are they engaging in? And what roles do your students engage in? Of course, depending on their purposes. So go ahead and turn to someone and talk. And go ahead and pause right now. Okay, you're back, and so am I. So what did you talk about? Okay, so Trey was asking for a clarification of a word. He didn't have experience with it. So Daniel had to clarify very specifically, as I'll point out, that very specific conversations low on the abstraction ladder were very beneficial. And what's also interesting is because Daniel was able to put it in terms Trey was able to understand, Trey, as you can see down below, he says, and then you should put that in your thesis to let your reader know how to do it. So because Daniel clarified enough, Trey took that information, made it his own, and then made a contribution. He said, oh, you should put that in your thesis. And it's awesome because Trey knows the function of the thesis and how it's supposed to work in the paper. And he thought that sounded like a great thesis for Daniel. And Daniel agreed. All right, and a quick look at the discussion roles by student. You can see Aiden, yes, he talked the most, and his roles were pretty much spread across the board somewhat evenly, more than others. You can see that he summarized and supported the most. And Heather, she initiated, meaning she asked about new ideas and organized the group more than anyone else. And that's also why, as you can see in the middle, she was the one that really kept track of the discussion and moved it along when she thought was necessary, compared to the other roles that are directly related to writing. Onward to the lens of the abstraction ladder. You are looking at two graphs. The one on the left is the frequency and distribution of abstraction talk. I actually had to create three categories to code my students' abstraction talk: low, medium, and high. So low level talk would be very specific and concrete, like the word magnanimous, or actually referring to words or grammatical aspects. Medium level talk would contain categories like word choice or transitions or paragraphs. And high level would be very abstract, referring to just about anything. For example, my students often said, it was good. And actually that happened about 6% of the time when they were talking about writing directly. And also I noted shifts from high to low and low to high. There were not many shifts at all, but there were more high to low, meaning going from general to specific down the ladder and going low to high up the ladder. And what I found was shifts downward were more productive and beneficial for students to understand what they were talking about. Now, the graph on the right is the abstraction talk by student. Now, as you can see, Aiden on the left has the most medium abstraction talk, and then him and Heather are very close in their high-level abstraction talk, which, again, not the most beneficial. When Heather and Aiden often were saying things like, it was good or it was confusing, that really didn't help the group in terms of what they were actually referring to. Now, I want to bring your attention to Trey. Trey's data I really think is most ideal. You can see he has the most low-level abstract talk. He has, a mid-range amount of medium abstraction and then the lowest high-level abstraction talk. This is, I think, ideal. I realize that it is important for students to be able to navigate or move up and down the ladder depending on their purpose and the task. But what I found was the more specific students were in talking about their writing, the easier it was for them to understand and the more able they were to take that talk and apply it to their writing. Okay, here's another interesting tidbit. You are looking at another discussion between Aiden and Trey. So I want to ask you before you read, what is Trey trying to point out to Aiden? And does Aiden get it? Go ahead and read through, and then when you're finished, talk about what you are finding. And remember to keep the abstraction ladder lens in mind. All right, so how did it go? Okay, well, one thing I noticed was that Aiden thinks he's being specific enough when he says, and I'm quoting, find something in your house that needs replacing or buying. That means you need to get something new or you need to get something replaced. Trey's like, what are you talking about? You're not saying that in your paper. And Aiden is thinking that he is being specific enough. And so Trey doesn't see it. So I thought it was so interesting that Trey knew that he wasn't being specific enough. Now, here's another awesome finding that I had, and that's this. Trey, he has 504 eligibility for thinking processes and extra processing time. Those are some of the accommodations he has on standardized tests. So with that in mind, and all that means is, yeah, it takes him a little longer to think. So while some may view that as a disability, in this context, him taking that extra time enabled him to talk about the writing and others' writing more specifically. And because I found that the more specific they were in talking about writing, he had the most low-level abstraction talk. And so, like I said, I think that's so cool that he actually was very, very helpful in the group because of how specific he was. So despite his 504, he was a very, very vital player in the group, and they will attest to that too, because in their interviews they were saying how specific students were in helping each other. Really, really was a prime factor. Alright, so to wrap up, like I said, I found that the lower my students' talk on the abstraction ladder was about their writing directly, the easier it was for others to understand and apply that talk in their writing, which was a very, very crucial aspect of their talk. Shifts up the ladder, not so productive because it got more general. And moving down the ladder was a very, very productive shift. Another observation revealed that some students didn't really work on their writing in between meetings, and so they didn't have as much to contribute. And I am referring to Trey specifically. He came to me several times asking me what to do. Should I do this? Should I do that? And I just responded, go ask your writing group. Also, prior experience I thought would play a big role in how my group got along, what they talked about, and how they conducted themselves, but it really didn't seem to affect them that greatly, with Heather and Aiden only having experience from 7th and 6th grade respectively. I thought that just might help in terms of staying on task and really benefiting the group as a whole and their writing. Now, the group's talk did become more engaging the 2nd, 4th, and 5th meetings. Now, as a teacher researcher, the 2nd meeting was still in my classroom with all the other groups meeting at the same time. So the 2nd meeting, I think they became more comfortable, but after that meeting and after I transcribed the data, it was very difficult to hear them as my recording materials were too good, if you will. So I moved them outside in the hallway, and I think that isolation really helped them narrow their talk and just focus, definitely, because the amount of times they talked in the latter meetings, the 4th and 5th meetings, were just more. They talked more and they talked longer. And also, Heather was the primary discussion mover. She seemed to monitor what the group was talking about and if they've exhausted that talk, and really just keeping track of the group's progress as well. The biggest two ideas for me and my students basically come from the fact that I didn't really debrief with them about their groups and how they went. So I need to do that is one big idea with them, and they need to do it too. And hey, we could do it together. Why not? We need to talk about what went well, what didn't go well, and what can change in the future to benefit us as individuals and the group and ultimately our writing. And so, really, I think bringing these conversations to a conscious level will benefit everyone as a whole and every type of learner.